Crime reporting it's a pretty tough job. It's really difficult. And, there's a lot to sort through. The American legal system is complex. It's complicated. And, at the end of the day, there's a lot at stake when you're outlining a crime story, the who, the what, trying to figure out all of that. But what about outside the United States? What about in a place like South Africa, where there's an incredibly high crime rate? The system works a little bit differently. And I think a lot of us don't get a lot of exposure to that. We're going to talk about that today on Deviant Off Script with journalist, anchor, and South African Robyn Curnow. She was front and center for years in Johannesburg for a couple of different news outlets. She is a native South African, and she has, decades of experience in the field there as a reporter, as an anchor. And particularly, she covered the Oscar Pistorius trial, which you may remember. He was the Blade Runner, the double amputee who competed in the Paralympics and a number of other events, who was convicted of killing his girlfriend, 2014. Robyn's seen a lot, and she's been in the thick of it. So here it is, my talk for this week's Deviant Off Script, journalist Robyn Curnow. Robyn, one of the things that I think in our universe, our team, we obviously we talk a lot about true crime. Yeah. But the other thing we talk about a lot is journalism, and also as it relates to true crime. And we're going to get to that. Okay. But I'd love to start, if you can kind of take me back to how Robyn Curnow got the journalism bug, because it seems everybody's kind of got a story of some kind. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious how you got into this universe.
So I became a journalist a long, long time ago because I started really, really young, actually. So I was on air when I was 22 for the South African Broadcasting Corporation's national news. Now, just if you go back, this is in the early to mid 1990s in South Africa. Nelson Mandela had just become president, and there was basically only one television news program. And that had traditionally, through apartheid, been a propaganda broadcaster. It was the state broadcaster, and it had put out apartheid propaganda. Right. So post-1994, in South Africa's democratic election, Mandela comes in as trying to cobble together this new democratic rainbow nation. And, there were various ways he did it. But one of the ways was that, he was a great storyteller in many ways, Mandela. He tried to sort of project in his own actions the way he'd like the country to be. And I was brought in as somebody, as a young, literally such a fresh green face, because so many of the other reporters had been somehow tainted by their reporting connected to apartheid. Right. So there was a group of us, a very small group of us, but, we were sort of the new breed of multicultural, dynamic, new South Africans. And it wasn't like an explicit kind of directive, but I picked up that, we were having to reflect the new South Africa back to itself. Yeah. And so I spent the whole Mandela presidency and then the next presidency of Thabo Mbeki traveling around South Africa, going to the hills of KwaZulu-Natal, into the townships, across the country, and sort of interviewing people and doing news stories that kind of cast a mirror back at South Africa to kind of underlie the commonalities that we had, even though we were also divided. 11 official languages. All my reports were then translated into Xhosa or Zulu or Sotho or Venda or Afrikaans. So, we would be doing the basic report, and then it would be translated into all the other languages. So you really had to reflect the commonality, the universality of the nation, rather than what's happening with the media now in America is the differences between people. So that's my sort of origin story.
Right. And before we kind of get to some of the true crime stuff, I am curious. It's interesting you use kind of this metaphor of like kind of reflecting the mirror back on the country. I'm curious, from in that experience, how did South Africa handle seeing that reflection?
Well, I think that's the real power of journalism, and that old school journalism where Particularly those were the days where you did turn on the television set at a specific time. So you all are watching the same report. It's not this fragmented environment now where people are getting their news, not just on different broadcasters or whatever, but in different ways. And I think it was a very important part of that democratic experiment at the beginning, on the success of Mandela trying to rebrand South Africa back at South Africans, because you had to bring the nation along.
Yeah.
And, he was just one man, and, we all followed him because, he was this extraordinary human being and because he had sacrificed so much. But then you also need to bring along the grandmother and the auntie and the different tribal and language groups. And the way to do that is to show each other that actually you're not that different. And even if it is a crime story, now South Africa is probably one of the most dangerous places in the world. Certainly has one of the highest murder rates in the world in Johannesburg and Pretoria, where I grew up, where I raised my children. So often, interestingly, that sense of loss that comes from a crime story is one way that you can create a sense of, like, if it's a very poor Black grandmother who's lost her granddaughter in the hills of KwaZulu-Natal, a wealthy Jewish northern suburbs bridge playing mom is going to identify with that too. And so often, those stories, even if it was a simple crime story, or if it was, and I say simple because there were so many that it was sort of like, but if you told those stories through the basis of human nature and family and love and loss, and sort of that, the commonality of that meant that everybody could feel, even if that person was so different from you. So yes, so that was what, the power of the national news became, at least for me. And I still find that is such an important part of my sense of why journalism is absolutely fundamental to democracy.
Right. Do you remember the first time, the stories you were talking about when you were kind of doing that reflecting of South Africa back on itself, and talking about people's experiences and talking about, how they, what their lives were like at that point. Do you remember the first crime story that you were on, and when you realized, I think a lot of people, journalists are in the streets and in the thick of this, talking to people who've gone through horrific things. Can you talk to me about the first time you covered a story that was really like, okay, this is a very, very real thing?
I do, actually. And it's, the thing also with crime stories, as but particularly in those days, for television, they're very hard to visualize, because you've either got to recreate it, or you're often not allowed too close to the crime scene. So you have to actually be quite adaptive and creative in how you visualize a 2-minute crime story. So the first one, I was very young. There was the Carlton Hotel, it's now sort of disheveled and broken down in Johannesburg. But central Johannesburg used to be one of the sort of fancy hotels. I can't remember the details because this is over 30 years ago. Right. But there was a young man who was found dead in sort of a laundry chute. And there'd obviously been, he worked at the hotel, and there'd been a fight or an altercation, or he had been robbed, and his body had been kind of thrown down the laundry chute, and he had been found at the bottom of it. And I remember it was the first time I remember interviewing his mother, who was utterly distraught. And it became also, she was just, her grief was so raw that it kind of also became this sort of galvanizing sense about, crime in South Africa and Johannesburg is so bad. And there was a sort of solidarity protest, or a solidarity kind of memorial service for this young man afterwards. And I can't remember, it was a week or two after his death, or his body had been found. But in an area of Johannesburg called the Zoo Lake. So there's sort of a lake, and then there's a big grassy patch. And everybody who had lost somebody was asked to bring, oh my God, I'm going to cry, a pair of their shoes. And all these families from across Johannesburg brought a pair of their murdered loved one's shoes. And you had this grass, this playground of empty shoes laid out of all these people who had been murdered. And it was an extraordinarily visual way of hitting home just how bad the crime rate was and how many people had been lost to robberies and rapes and murders and sort of unsolved, brutal, violence against women and all of that. And I can still see it. I can still see that image of all those pairs of shoes lined up next to each other on a Sunday afternoon and, in the Johannesburg heat. It was devastating.
It's an amazing image. And you're right in that, crime stories oftentimes are difficult to tell with images just because of a lot of the restrictions that are in place. I'm curious from your standpoint, what it is you think draws people to these kinds of stories. And I'm not even really, and obviously true crime kind of in the media space is, people always talk about how popular it is now. And my thought is always like, it's not just now. This is something people have been fascinated with since Jack the Ripper, since, the 20th century, early 20th century. I'm curious from your standpoint, what you think it is that people are drawn to reading, consuming, listening, watching stories like this, and why that is.
I think it maybe goes back to that point that I made that, there's almost a common denominator that even in a place like South Africa, which has huge inequality between races, between demographics, it cuts across class and society, but almost nobody is immune from being woken up in the middle of the night by an intruder in their bedroom. Mm-hmm. You can be a very wealthy white person in the suburbs with high walls and electric fences, and there are still cases daily almost. You can be a farmer on a plot outside, Pretoria. You're just as vulnerable as a family in a township in Gugulethu or in Soweto. Everybody is connected in South Africa by being attacked or the threat of being attacked. So I think it is a leveler that, if you're a very poor person and you see somebody who has more than you and they've also been taken out or nearly taken out, you're like, well, I can feel their pain. And I think that is probably the converse is that you live with this sense of often sort of anticipating or planning or trying to protect yourself from being attacked, so that when somebody else is attacked, you're like, oh, thank God it wasn't me. And, oh, poor things, but thank God it wasn't me.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there's this sort of, so on one hand, conversely, you're also sort of thinking, oh my God, imagine if it was me. Oh no. It's not even 6 degrees of separation. There's that sort of, there by the grace of God go I, or my family. So yes, again, I think it's sort of a sense of horror of what could happen or a sense of connection, what has happened.
And it's also, a lot of times I think, I'm just kind of having this thought as we're talking about it, it's like, it also challenges and oftentimes shatters what we all think to be true, or notions or preconceived notions. I mean, how many times have we done stories, right? True crime stories or crime stories of any magnitude where the lead is something about, this wasn't supposed to happen here.
Yeah.
Or this isn't something we're used to. And I think what that does is it challenges our notion of what we think to be true. And there's some sort of attraction that people have to that.
I think you're so right. And, it's not, and that's why sometimes sort of the craziest crime stories make the headlines. And then, more often than not, you think, oh, well, this should never have happened. Who would have believed? But then you peel back the layers and you realize that there is a pattern behind it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, I think for me, those WTF crime stories, yes, they have legs in terms of, at least in America, ratings, for example. But there is also that sense that, again, you're like, well, at least it shows that maybe this couldn't have happened to me, or I don't know. I mean, I can tell you the biggest WTF crime story I ever covered, still to this day, and I know many South Africans who would listen to this remember this because it was the biggest story of the day. And I was a very young journalist and shouldn't really have been on. It was actually the first story that I ever led the news bulletin with. And in those days, we still had pagers, and everybody else was out on assignment and been given a job. And I was still a few months into being at the SABC in the newsroom. So it was probably 11 a.m. in the morning, and I didn't have an assignment. So I was kind of kicking around in the newsroom, and a pager came up. Pager message was something like, gorilla shot in zoo, police on the way, or something. Now, the zoo was right by the Johannesburg Bureau of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. I rushed down there with a cameraman and was just in time to see the big alpha male gorilla that had been in the zoo enclosure at the Johannesburg Zoo had been shot by an intruder who had been chased by police after the police had been alerted that he was burglarizing a house across the road from the zoo. So the police had chased this burglar through the zoo, and he had basically, to avoid the police, jumped into the gorilla's enclosure. The gorilla had come at him, and he had shot the gorilla, who then, of course, got even more angry and picked him up and kind of flung him around. And I even remember the robber's name. His name was Isaac Mofokeng. Then the police, believe it or not, hoiked themselves in and jumped into the zoo enclosure too, which of course further enraged the now injured gorilla.
Who does not realize this is a crime in progress.
Who does not realize, and also does not realize that, like many South African and many residents of Joburg, has now also become a crime statistic.
Right.
So I arrive at the zoo, and by that stage, the gorilla had been the robber and the cops had been dealt with, and the gorilla and the vets and the zookeepers had managed. The gorilla had been put on the back of a truck, what we call a bakkie in South Africa, but sort of a small sort of
like a flatbed kind of a thing.
A flatbed truck. He had been given a drip, and then the zoo is right near one of the poshest parts of South Africa. So I followed as this gorilla on the back of a small flatbed truck, being held by the zoo vets with a drip, was whizzed through Westcliff, the sort of mansions of this posh part of town, to the emergency care room at the Mill Park Hospital, where all the, where you get sent if there's a car crash or a shooting. Needless to say, he gets taken into the emergency ward and put on 2 gurneys together. This is a gorilla. And they whistle him in on 2 gurneys into the X-ray machine place and X-ray him to try and figure out where the bullet is.
Yeah.
Now, his name was Max, the gorilla, and he was now he was the headline. He was Max, the crime-fighting gorilla.
I mean, there's nothing about this that's not an amazing story.
Isn't it a craziest story? And, I had this all on video. And, still to this day at the zoo, Max sadly has obviously passed away. It was a long time ago. But there's a statue of Max, the gorilla, the crime-fighting gorilla, at the Johannesburg Zoo right now. But that was my first crime story. And you know why it was so big? A, because it was a gorilla who had been shot, but because he became another crime statistic. Right. Nobody was immune from being shot in their home.
Right.
Even the gorilla.
Over the years, and I've had these conversations with other journalists and people that work in this universe, is like, if you hear 100 times that this is not supposed to happen here, at some point you have to stop saying it, because it absolutely does happen here.
Yeah.
It's just, it's amazing. I wanted to ask you, you've talked a lot about the violence in South Africa. For those of us who are not aware, what was the root of that violence? What was it that made it so violent?
And it's it's current as well. It's still there. So I moved to America 10 years ago. I went back to South Africa in November last year with my teenage daughters, who I haven't really taken back. And we were nearly kidnapped in Johannesburg 4 months ago. We would fake cops try to run us off the road. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I was a journalist who'd had war zone training, and because I know how to deal with myself. And as my kids said, I went full Tom Cruise. You went full badass, Mom. And I basically had a highway chase. We were being chased down the highway in Johannesburg by fake cops. And this happens every day. And people in America say to me, well, why didn't you stop? How did you know that they weren't real cops. And I said, well, even if there'd been real cops, I wouldn't have stopped, because there's so much corruption and so much violence that a number of real policemen are often in the dock for being involved in some sort of crime. So, South Africa is a violent place for a number of reasons. I think top is the legacy of apartheid. Absolutely. You grow up in a brutalized, systemized, racist, institutionalized kind of discriminatory environment. People become, deal with problems in the wrong way. And this becomes a societal issue.
Right.
There are real issues around poverty. There are real issues around youth unemployment. And there are real issues around actual just the justice system working. So crime is done with impunity. And a lot of this it improved after apartheid, but it's been 30 years now. And the new government, the ANC, there's now been a coalition government. I mean, it's a huge failure of post-apartheid South Africa, that the democracy in many ways has not been able to sustain a rule of law that makes it safe for any South African. And I really mean that across the board. You are not safe. So I think, it makes South Africans incredibly astute in terms of situational awareness. I mean, you put us into any environment and I tell you, we've got eyes in the back of our head.
Right.
But yes, I mean, I also don't know why there is something deep within South African society there is a darkness there in our souls, and I'm not quite sure why the violence is so brutal. You're not just murdered, you raped and tortured and then murdered.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like there's something about the sort of nature of crime in South Africa that is just startling. But a lot of it has to do with poverty, unemployment,
sure,
broken families,
desperate.
And a rule of law and a legal system that, really doesn't deter people.
Do you think that the general public in South Africa, when it comes to, you mentioned the brutality, does that still resonate, or is there a sense of, or a desensitization because of that?
Well, I mean, it also, again, goes back to your point. You're like, well, that could never have happened until it does. So a lot of these murders, farm murders, rapes, I mean, I remember very early on when Charlize Theron had just won, she's South African, as you know, and has involved in her own murder story. Her mother killed her father, Charlize's father, during an altercation with Charlize there. And so, but I remember also 30 years ago, Charlize trying to sort of have some sort of awareness about the amount of rapes in South Africa. And I can't remember the stat, but it was something bonkers then. And it's just as bad now that a woman is raped every, I should actually have 30 seconds, 3 minutes. I don't know. It's too much.
Either one, right? Either one is appalling.
I mean,
right.
I mean, I think I think everybody knows somebody who's been killed or raped or robbed.
Yeah.
And so you tend to, like when we were there in South Africa, we didn't just nearly get run off this is literally in my little safe zone.
Right.
My daughter
within the last 6 months.
This is recently, yeah. And my daughter's phone was stolen, and then we were also sort of, something else happened, which was minor. And every time you said it to a South African, they're like, okay, yeah, well, my phone was also stolen. Or, oh God, I also got, hijacked there, a month ago. Don't worry, as long as you're not dead or raped, you're fine.
Right.
You know what I mean? So your sort of base of, you have a very loose association with your property as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of perspective on material goods in South Africa because it doesn't stay with you for very long.
Well, my God, the resilience of like having to go through, I just can't imagine like trying to be run off the road. Like if that's a common occurrence after, if you're there for 20 years, the number of instances, I just can't imagine.
And I think that's the thing when people, and I think that's what's also so important. Yes, I'm a white South African. This was just outside one of the more, I don't want to say sort of, but one of the suburbs. So but it was, this is a daily occurrence for everyone, black, white,
right,
old, young, whether you've got a fancy car or whether you've got kind of a jalopy of a car. Everybody seems to be, trying to navigate this. And this is why it's such a leveler. But again, as you rightly say, I mean, I think when you grow up in an environment like that, you're becoming incredibly resilient.
Right.
And you have which is why I think so many South Africans do so well, and particularly if, there's a sort of sense of hard work, and you have a very, very astute sense of the world and what can be lost.
Yeah. It's like, I have a very, very dear friend who's English, and, we spend a lot of time together. We visit often, and, he has said to me, he is shocked at how not shocked I am about the prevalence of guns just being everywhere all the time. And he's like, I just cannot wrap my head around the fact that you go to a party and somebody might have a gun in their pocket. And I'm like, that's just how this is how it works, man. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, you did a lot of coverage on the Oscar Pistorius story. If you could talk to us a little bit about what that story was to South Africa, and kind of your experience covering that as sort of like the kind of story that is a crime story that really becomes sort of part of the national conversation.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people at the time tried to bring a prism of like, this was like O.J. Simpson,
right.
But I think it was different because, again, it was part of the national conversation. And again, this was one of these unbelievable crime stories that reflected the nation back at itself. But it wasn't like OJ. It wasn't a racial thing. Oscar had a lot of Black supporters. He had been very involved with a lot of charities in many Black communities. He was seen as a champion, as an underdog. So there was not a racial kind of division that I think you might have seen with OJ. The Oscar Pistorius story in itself still sits with me. Nobody won out of that one. It was just a tragedy on every level. And I think what was interesting for us, I was CNN's Africa correspondent at the time, and I had actually covered Oscar for almost 6-7 years previously. So I knew him. I'd put him on air on on CNN Sports. We had kind of, been part of his journey to having sort of global success.
Sure. Right.
Because he was at once, he went from this young kid who was trying to run to being in the Olympics, running with able-bodied athletes with being severely disabled. He had his legs removed just below his knees because he was born with a birth defect. So Oscar as a human being is an extraordinary man to have got that far.
Sure.
Nobody else has been in the Olympics without any legs. And I think it was one of those stories where it was a combination of that sort of Icarus factor where you fly too close to the sun.
Yep.
The incident where he shot and killed his girlfriend, Reva, happened a few months after the end of the Olympics. And so I think there's a lot about, that. I think what came out certainly in the trial, and I was in the trial every day in Pretoria, was there was an attempt, yes, to portray him as a woman beater and a kind of terribly unpleasant human being who murdered her after a fight.
Right.
That was not proved to be the case in the final judgment. He was charged and is served and is now out on bail. He was found guilty of killing her, but he was not found guilty of intentionally murdering her.
Right.
And I think that whatever happened in that room that night, and I've been in that room, I filmed it for CNN, I think is going to be lost in time. What I do know is that the Oscar that I spoke to, interviewed, knew was not a kind of murdering, psychopathic, crazy person. He was a very compelling human being, and I don't know what happened that night. And I think it also, just even our broader conversation, I think that you can certainly bring in South Africa's crime rate and the fact that he felt vulnerable without his legs on at night. I still don't know. I am not of the opinion that he kind of chased her in a fit of rage, just based on what I heard in the court and what I know about him. But he made a fatal, fatal error. Whoever he thought he was shooting unseen through that door was a stupid, crazed thing to do, and he should never have done it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I tend to be quite open-minded on that case. And I thought it was really important not to bring some sort of trying to stick some perspective on that reporting without the court case coming to what its final judgment was,
right?
Which was that he didn't intentionally track her down,
right? I'm curious. I know what the appetite for that story was like here in the States. Can you sort of paint for us the picture of what the appetite was like in South Africa? From the public standpoint and from the media standpoint. Honestly, I mean, you said you were in court every day. I imagine you had assignment editors and producers who were like, "You will be on this until you're not." Essentially, just kind of walk me through that.
Yeah, it was also, what was interesting about it? It was also, I think, one of the first Twitter trials.
Yes.
I was in the end, I landed up, instead of, you worked at CNN too, we had a very clear system of updating news within the sort of CNN systems. And in the end, because I was in the courtroom, we made a decision that I would be live tweeting what was happening in the courtroom. And then the news editors in Atlanta would be taking my live tweets and putting them into our CNN Wire copy.
Right.
So it was the first time that, the cart became before the horse.
Yeah, I was going to say it's going out and then coming back in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because me trying to, we just couldn't keep, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Me trying to file a wire, whether it was 5 minutes or an hour after what had happened in court, just wasn't good enough because Twitter was already kind of rolling with it.
Right.
So the sort of appetite for the live, that was the first time I covered a story like that. I don't know if that had been like that on any other story beforehand. And that's why I think it also was globalized to such an extent. What they also did was that that court case, if you remember, was broadcast live. So you could watch it and the whole of South Africa would just stop. And, it was South African justice is fabulous on one level because it was just very old school. And there was this sort of very stop-start. It wasn't over like an American trial in 2 weeks. It went on for almost a year. And, you'd stop for tea breaks and then, there'd be all these sorts of shenanigans and then you'd come back 2 weeks later. So it went on for months and months and months and months. And you would know, okay, it's back on tomorrow. And people were skipping work. It was broadcast on just everywhere.
Yeah.
It was watched and then picked apart and then replayed at night if you missed it. People became armchair crime experts and forensic experts in a way that really hadn't happened in South Africa before. And I think certainly even for the States, it was fascinating because it was such a foreign crime in such a foreign courtroom.
In the news universe, there's so much now that we find out beforehand. There's leaks and people telling things before they're official and, people who are plugged in and kind of getting all of this stuff before it's official. The thing that is fascinating to me about the legal system, and really it's anywhere really, is that a trial is much like almost like sports in that you literally do not know there's never been a verdict that's leaked. Like a judge's decision is not leaked.
And the twists and turns of the trial, there's always a sort of a gasp or now what's happened? Or
the immediate, it's literally in the moment. And when I watch a trial and a verdict comes out, it's always interesting to me because the jury files in and it's like, in that moment, the only people that know the fate of the defendant are the 12 people sitting in the box. And they hand the jury form to the judge. The judge looks at it and it's like, well, now there's another person that knows. And literally none of us know until it is read. And it's interesting because oftentimes when a jury reads a verdict, it's so emotionless and detached. Like I always think about O.J. Simpson.
Yeah.
That verdict is the most notorious verdict in the history of the American legal system. And when you hear it, it's read so robotically and without any feeling. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but my larger point is that it's very unique, the courts and trials in that way when it comes to the media and news, because you aren't going to know.
No, and I think that's what you're saying. I mean, essentially the narrative arc plays out and you're a part of it. So almost it's like an old Shakespearean theater, that the audience becomes part of the entertainment, because, you know, while yes, I had, you know, that courtroom, and just remember the courtroom in the Oscar Pistorius trial, as most courts in South Africa, there is no jury. So it's just the judge.
Mm-hmm.
And the various sort of prosecuting and defense teams, and then family, and then, you know, the lucky journalists who sort of get the golden ticket, and then everybody else. And I think because it was live streamed and because it was Twitter streamed, you really got a sense of being part of this drama. And it was, like I said, and was Shakespearean or, you know, like I said, a Greek myth, an Icarus thing. You feel like you're watching such an utterly human story of love and betrayal and death and, you know, and family and all that stuff that is so intrinsically human plays out in a trial. And particularly one like Oscar Pistorius's, it just sort of, it ignited everybody in sort of judging what they would have done if they thought there'd been an intruder in their home that night. Would they have pulled their gun out? Would you have noticed that your girlfriend wasn't asleep next to you? How could you have not noticed that? If you had no legs, would you also have been illogical? Was this a rate of, you know, an example of high rates of women abuse? You know, too many guns in South Africa, too many women are killed. All of this, you know, comes into that narrative, and then you kind of listening to people explain themselves, or the dryness of the sort of the forensic descriptions, or the sort of the way, you know, the way a cop or a psychologist or whoever's on the witness stand manages to sort of lose the narrative or win the narrative. I mean, it was just, it was fascinating.
Well,
I think you're so right.
And the other thing is that, you know, kind of this Shakespearean element of like, there's a defendant, there's a villain, and the villain has family, and the family is defending the villain. So the bad guy has defenders. There's the victim, who's sort of the protagonist in a lot of ways. The victim has a family who is, you know, mourning the loss of this person, but also having to, you know, keep their fingers crossed that the villain gets convicted. Like all of these pieces. Like, as we're talking about this, like, I'm like, of course people have an insatiable appetite for these stories, is because they're the perfect story in so many ways.
And, you know, there is also, so there's always, and when you talk about victims and villains, you know, and I think South Africans, we talked about this earlier about being resilient. South Africans are also very comfortable sometimes with sort of gray areas. You know, you understand why people commit crime on one level because of unemployment, because of the history of apartheid. You know what I mean? There's sort of you don't just sort of automatically say, well, everybody is bad, because that's pretty much, you know.
Well, I would say, and Americans do not have this ability to funnel this
to be able to sort of, so people weren't just sort of, they were, again, there's this projection on, well, you know, can I understand why he acted like this? And how would even as the villain, Oscar was never really, people still had this love for this kid with no legs. Their great hero, the great golden boy who ran at the Olympics, who was almost the mythology and the symbol of South Africa as a scrappy nation who kind of held its own on the world stage, even though we were this small little, you know, poor country at the back end of Africa. You know what I mean? Like Oscar in many ways also kind of was this idealized version of ourselves, no matter whether you were white or black. So seeing him fall so spectacularly, make such a terrible mistake or an intentional act, really had people kind of wrestling with the broader conversations around society, around disabled people, around crime, around, you know, gated communities, around all of that stuff.
Status, class, all of those things.
It was a very nuanced conversation, I found. And I thought that was really interesting, that people did project their own stuff onto that. And I think still today you will find people it's a little sympathetic to him.
Yeah. You make a very interesting point, because what and this is sort of my, mini soapbox here, is that like, I don't think that in large part the American public has the ability to look at things with sort of like that gray area you talked about. I mean,
well, look at the election. This is the problem
right.
with politics.
And in even in murder cases, and I have covered so many like this, it is imperative that you pick a side, and you are either pro prosecution or pro defense. He did it or he didn't do it. There's no time for nuance. There's no time for the irony being the whole point of the court system, which is innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly.
And like, it's just, there's none of that. And it's incredibly frustrating, when you're covering these cases and trying to find people who have some connection to it that aren't kind of like already standing on one side or the other. And it's just, it's been fascinating to kind of see that evolve over the years.
That must be interesting. I mean, I haven't covered any American court cases. I think I've covered as an anchor. I kind of reported on them, but I wasn't in the in the courtroom as I have been with when I was a correspondent, a foreign correspondent in Africa on that stuff.
Yeah, and
I think that sense of nuance and sort of the complexity and the messiness of life, and the sort of. And maybe it's just the way I look at things. I try this new podcast that I've just launched. I'm trying to understand America right now, again, through this sort of perspective of like, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm just a foreigner with attitude. You know what I mean? It's sort of,
yeah.
And I think it's a healthy place to be because, you've got to be able to see what's happening now politically in America without taking a dogmatic stand for or against. Yeah. Because there has to be some sort of nuance if this country is going to move forward. Mm-hmm. And sort of the sense that, again, this sort of collective understanding of all of us actually have more in common than we have apart. And that can take, we have to be able to have the empathy to see the humanity behind the killer, to see the humanity behind the politician you don't like, to see the humanity behind your neighbor who voted differently, to see the humanity behind the instincts of some of even the worst people who have been on trial.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes involves us actually just stepping out of our own shoes.
And listening, sort of honestly. I think a lot of times, I remember as a kid, hearing teachers say you have 2 ears and one mouth because you need to listen twice as much as you speak.
Yeah.
And it's funny that as we get older, we still sometimes don't adhere to that guidance. Before we go, Robyn, I want to give you a chance to mention the name of your podcast. We're going to have it in our show notes and all of that stuff. But just talk to us a little bit about the show, what it's called, and a little bit more about your goal and your intention with it.
Well, thanks. Yeah. So it's called Searching for America. And it's sort of, I became an American citizen a few years ago. I moved here 10 years ago. And my daughters are now, I've brought them up and they're American. And so, and I live in the South. I live in Atlanta in the deep South. And particularly having covered the first few American elections for CNN as an anchor, I was very much in the belly of the beast. And, now that I'm no longer at CNN, I really wanted to understand why my neighbors were voting one way or the other. And my kids play sport, and anyone who has kids who play sport know that you travel all over Georgia. So I've been finding myself over the years sitting in all parts of Georgia with all sorts of voters and getting to understand the parents. And so not every Trump voter is, a certain type of person, and not every Biden voter or Kamala voter was a certain type of person. And the nuances of why people were choosing each, I just thought it was really important to sort of try and avoid these stereotypes. And why I thought it was likely that Trump would win, and that if he did win, we needed to sort of embrace the conversation about what it means to be an American, why so many Americans support him, and how this country can move forward. So a lot of my conversations are kind of with old spies, old musicians. I do want to get a bit more country music in because I love country music, but you know what I mean? So it's good, solid Americans across the political spectrum talking about their lives. I've got a doctor coming on who's an African-American woman who is not pro-Trump, but she's RFK.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's why Americans, and I'm aiming it mostly to, the outside, my old CNN International audience, people who are trying to understand America and the instincts behind all of this change. And I'm trying to basically say to people, these are the good Americans I know.
Yeah.
And this is why people have chosen this in this moment, and this is where we're going.
Yeah.
It's quite funny, and like I said, I have a pretty broad and hopefully empathetic way of looking at where we are in the world right now. It's time of immense change. We've got to move forward. You've got to stop complaining about the past.
Right. And I imagine it is available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, all of the things.
All of it. Searching for americapod.com is the website, and yes, you can find it wherever you're looking.
Alrighty, Robyn Curnow, thank you for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for having me. Good luck with yours as well.